A single word sent into the darkness: gunman. No explanation, no follow-up, just silence where laughter used to be. In the heart of South Boston, behind glass walls overlooking the harbor, two healers who saved lives every day couldn't save their own. The date was May 5, 2017. The place was a luxury penthouse that promised safety. The reality became a crime scene that would haunt a city for years. Dr. Lena Bolanos and Dr. Richard Field weren't strangers to violence. They treated its victims in emergency rooms. But when danger came to their door, it wore a familiar face. Someone they'd seen in passing. Someone trusted with keys and codes. Someone whose resentment had festered into something unforgivable. This is the story of how envy became murder. How a text message became a final warning. How justice, delayed by legal battles and denials, finally arrived. What happens when the people meant to protect us become the ones we should fear? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The skyline glittered in the fading light of early May. Boston's South End hummed with evening traffic, the city exhaling after another workday. Along Dorchester Avenue, the McAllen Building stood tall, a tower of glass and steel that spoke of success, of arrival, of safety earned through hard work. Inside its walls, residents moved through their routines, cooking dinner, checking emails, preparing for another tomorrow. On the 11th floor, in a corner unit with panoramic views, two people who dedicated their lives to healing others were winding down. Dr. Lena Bolanos, 38, an anesthesiologist with steady hands and a gift for calming anxious patients, moved through her kitchen with practiced ease. Dr. Richard Field, 49, a surgeon known for his meticulous technique and adventurous spirit, stood at the window watching the harbor lights flicker to life. They'd met through medicine, bonded over shared values, and built a life that balanced intense professional demands with quiet domestic joy. Colleagues at Boston Medical Center admired them separately and together. Lena mentored young women entering the medical field, offering guidance through the grueling years of training. Richard volunteered for medical missions abroad, treating patients in places where healthcare barely existed. They were planning their wedding, talking about children, mapping out a future that extended far beyond the penthouse walls. But futures require time. And time, on that spring evening, was running out. The McAllen Building wasn't just any apartment complex. It marketed itself as luxury living with premium security, keycard access, surveillance cameras, a concierge desk monitoring who came and went. Residents paid for more than views and granite countertops. They paid for the promise that nothing bad could reach them here. The building's promotional materials emphasized safety as much as amenities. In a city where neighborhoods change block by block, the McAllen represented a fortress. Yet every fortress has its vulnerabilities. Every system has someone who knows it from the inside. Bampumim Teixeira had once worked in that building. As a concierge, he'd learned its rhythms, memorized its access codes, observed the residents coming and going in their professional clothes and expensive cars. He'd held doors, accepted packages, smiled politely while resentment calcified in his chest. He saw people who, in his eyes, had everything he'd been denied: education, wealth, respect, the kind of life that felt permanently out of reach. His employment ended badly. He'd been fired, another rejection in a series of failures that included bank robberies and time in prison. But he remembered the building, he remembered the residents, and on May 5, 2017, he remembered how to get inside. The day had passed unremarkably for most of Boston. Weather forecasts predicted mild temperatures. News cycles churned through political controversies and sports scores. At Boston Medical Center, Lena finished her shift, texting Richard about dinner plans. He'd canceled an evening with a friend, choosing instead to stay home with her. They ordered takeout. They talked about the weekend ahead. At 7:40 p.m., Richard sent a text message to that friend, a message consisting of a single word: gunman. The friend stared at his phone, trying to make sense of it. A joke? Autocorrect? He tried calling back. No answer. He sent texts asking what was wrong. The messages delivered but remained unread. Minutes passed. The silence grew heavier. Something was wrong. He could feel it. By 8 p.m., the friend had called 911. He explained the strange text, the lack of response, his growing certainty that Richard was in danger. Dispatchers took the information seriously. Officers were assigned to check the address, 141 Dorchester Avenue, Unit 1101. When police arrived at the McAllen Building, nothing appeared unusual from the outside. The lobby was quiet. The elevators hummed normally. But as they ascended to the 11th floor, weapons drawn, every instinct told them they were walking towards something terrible. They knocked. No response. They announced their presence. Silence. Using the building's emergency access, they entered the penthouse. What they found inside would become evidence photographed and cataloged, described in courtrooms, and seared into the memories of everyone who saw it. Blood spattered across white walls, furniture overturned, signs of a prolonged, desperate struggle. And in the center of it all, two bodies, Dr. Lena Bolanos and Dr. Richard Field, lay bound, their lives stolen in acts of cruelty that transcended robbery or rage. Their hands had been tied, their throats had been cut, words were scrawled in blood on the walls, messages meant to mislead, to create a false narrative, to suggest motives that didn't exist. And standing there, bleeding from gunshot wounds sustained when officers confronted him, was Bampumim Teixeira. He held a knife. His clothes were soaked in blood that wasn't his own. His eyes showed no remorse, only defiance. Officers disarmed and arrested him. Paramedics confirmed what everyone already knew. The doctors were dead. The penthouse meant to be a sanctuary had become a slaughterhouse. Outside, neighbors gathered in confusion. Police radios crackled with coded language that translated to horror. By midnight, yellow crime scene tape blocked the 11th floor hallway. By dawn, news vans lined Dorchester Avenue. By the time the sun fully rose, all of Boston knew that something unforgivable had happened in a building designed to keep evil out. The investigation began immediately, though in truth, the ending was already written in blood and DNA. What remained was the patient work of reconstructing exactly how and why. Detectives arrived as crime scene technicians, photographed every angle, collected every fiber, documented every detail that would later stand as evidence in court. The scene told a story, but not a coherent one. Words scrawled on the wall read, "He killed my wife." The phrasing suggested a motive, revenge, jealousy, a love triangle. But investigators knew better than to trust messages written by killers. Their performances, misdirection, attempts to shape the narrative before the real story emerges. What the physical evidence revealed was more straightforward and infinitely darker. The victims had been tortured before being killed. Bindings around their wrists matched rope found in a backpack near the building. Jewelry boxes had been emptied, but the items were later found discarded, suggesting robbery was secondary, a crime of opportunity layered onto something more personal. Teixeira's own injuries told another part of the story. When officers burst into the penthouse, they'd found him armed and threatening. They'd opened fire in defense of their own lives, striking him multiple times. He'd survived, but barely. Now he lay in a hospital bed under guard, recovering from wounds that would become evidence of his presence at the scene. Detectives began tracing his movements before the attack. Surveillance footage from cameras around South Boston showed him withdrawing cash, purchasing supplies, pacing near the McAllen building, hours before Richard sent his desperate one-word warning. Receipts placed him at stores buying items found at the scene: gloves, a backpack, cleaning supplies. The timeline crystallized. Teixeira had planned this. Not meticulously, his actions were too chaotic for that, but with intention. He'd chosen this building because he knew it. He'd chosen this apartment because he'd seen these residents before, symbols of a life he resented. And he'd chosen this day because his rage finally outweighed his self-preservation. As word spread through Boston's medical community, grief moved like a wave. Colleagues gathered at Boston Medical Center, where both victims had worked, to process the incomprehensible. Lena's patients remembered her gentle reassurance before surgeries. Richard's fellow doctors recalled his steady presence during crises. Together, they'd represented the best of their profession: healers, driven by compassion rather than ego. Vigils formed spontaneously. Candles appeared outside the McAllen building, flowers piled against the entrance. Strangers left notes expressing shock and sorrow. In a city accustomed to urban crime, this felt different. This was targeted violence against people whose only offense was living successful lives in a building someone else had access to. Richard's final text, "gunman," haunted everyone who learned about it. One word, sent in a moment of clarity amid chaos. He'd known what was happening. He'd tried to warn someone. He'd hoped rescue would arrive in time. But technology, for all its promises of instant connection, couldn't summon help fast enough to matter. The botter friend who received that text would carry it forever. He'd acted on his instincts, called 911, tried to mobilize a response. But the penthouse was already a crime scene by the time officers arrived. The text became evidence, a timestamp proving when the attack began, a window into those final, desperate moments. Detectives interviewed Teixeira in his hospital bed, recording his statements as he drifted in and out of consciousness. Even wounded, he remained defiant. He claimed self-defense. He suggested the victims had invited him in. He invented a romantic relationship with Lena that never existed, a fantasy born from observation and delusion. None of it matched the evidence. None of it explained the torture, the bindings, the blood. As Teixeira recovered, the investigation deepened. Massachusetts State Police crime labs processed DNA found under the victim's fingernails, Teixeira's cells left behind as they fought for their lives. Blood spatter analysis reconstructed the sequence of violence. The initial attack, the struggle, the final fatal wounds. Every surface yielded evidence. Every item collected told part of the story. Within days, detectives had assembled an overwhelming case. Fingerprints placed Teixeira throughout the penthouse. DNA linked him to both victims. Surveillance tracked his approach. Witnesses confirmed he'd been fired from the building months earlier. His criminal history, bank robberies, violent behavior painted a portrait of escalating danger. Yet, knowing who did it and proving it in court are different challenges. Prosecutors began building a case designed to withstand every defense strategy, every attempt to muddy the narrative, every appeal to sympathy or doubt. They knew Teixeira would fight. They knew his attorneys would construct alternative theories. They prepared for a long battle. By mid-May, formal charges were filed. 2 counts of first-degree murder, home invasion, armed robbery, kidnapping. Each charge carried severe penalties. Together, they described not just a crime but a sustained attack designed to inflict maximum suffering. Prosecutors described it publicly as calculated cruelty, words that would echo through the eventual trial. The families of Dr. Bolanos and Dr. Field faced an impossible grief. They'd lost 2 people who embodied kindness and purpose. They'd lost futures that would never arrive, grandchildren never born, missions never completed, love never fully realized. But amid the devastation, they found resolve. They attended every court hearing. They spoke to the media with dignity. They demanded justice not as vengeance but as accountability. Boston watched with them. The case became a focal point, not just for its brutality, but for what it represented. 2 healers murdered by someone they'd never wronged. A security system bypassed by someone who'd once worked within it. Wealth and education offering no protection against rage and resentment. It touched on class tensions, on the illusion of safety, on the randomness of violence. Candlelight vigils continued outside the Suffolk County Courthouse. Community members organized memorials at both victims' hospitals. Medical students established scholarships in their names, ensuring their legacy would extend beyond their deaths. The city, so often fractured by neighborhood and income, unified in mourning. Summer arrived, bringing with it the methodical pace of legal proceedings. While the broader public moved on to other headlines, those connected to the case remained immersed in its details. Prosecutors spent months reviewing evidence, consulting forensic experts, preparing witnesses. Defense attorneys worked to construct any viable alternative to the obvious conclusion. And Teixeira, held without bail, maintained his invented narrative. The turning point came quietly, in a laboratory rather than a courtroom. Forensic analysts completed their final DNA analysis, comparing genetic material collected from the crime scene against samples from all involved parties. The results eliminated any remaining doubt. Teixeira's DNA was found under both victims' fingernails, microscopic evidence of their struggle to fight him off. His skin cells appeared on their clothing, on the restraints used to bind them, on the murder weapon itself. The concentration and distribution of this biological evidence told a story of prolonged contact, of violence inflicted over time rather than in a single moment. But the DNA evidence did more than place him at the scene. It disproved his central defense claim. Teixeira had suggested a consensual relationship with Lena, implying intimacy that might explain his presence and create ambiguity about events. The DNA pattern demolished this fiction. The evidence showed not consensual contact but violent struggle, defensive wounds, forced restraint, the biological markers of assault rather than intimacy. This scientific certainty shifted the case's nature. What began as a question of what happened became a moral reckoning about why. With guilt established beyond reasonable dispute, the remaining questions concerned motive, culpability, and consequences. The trial, when it eventually began, would focus less on identifying the killer and more on ensuring justice matched the crime's severity. Prosecutors refined their approach. They mapped Teixeira's movements in the weeks before the murders, showing premeditation rather than spontaneous violence. They documented his history of resentment toward the building's residents. They prepared to present his post-arrest statements, the invented romance, the self-defense claims, the attempts to blame victims for their own deaths. Defense attorneys faced an impossible task. The evidence was overwhelming. The defendant's statements contradicted physical facts. Their strategy became one of mitigation rather than exoneration, trying to avoid the harshest penalties rather than proving innocence. They filed motions challenging the admissibility of certain photographs, arguing that crime scene images were too inflammatory. They requested psychological evaluations, suggesting mental health factors might explain the inexplicable. Judges ruled against most of these motions. The evidence was relevant. The photographs documented reality. And while mental health assessments were conducted, they revealed no condition that would absolve Teixeira of responsibility. He'd planned the attack. He'd executed it with awareness of his actions. He'd tried to mislead investigators afterward. These weren't the behaviors of someone incapable of understanding right from wrong. As preparation continued, the case acquired its media nickname, the South Boston Penthouse Murders. The phrase appeared in headlines, in television reports, in conversations across the city. It reduced two complex lives to a location and a crime, but it also ensured the case remained in public consciousness. People who'd never met the victims felt invested in seeing justice delivered. By early 2019, nearly 2 years after the murders, the trial date approached. Suffolk's Superior Court assigned Judge Christine Roach to preside, a jurist known for measured authority and strict procedural fairness. Her courtroom became the stage where months of preparation would finally unfold before a jury tasked with rendering judgment. Jury selection proved challenging. Nearly everyone in Boston knew about the case. Finding impartial jurors required extensive questioning about preconceived opinions and exposure to media coverage. Eventually, 12 people were seated, citizens who would hear evidence, evaluate credibility, and decide whether the prosecution had proven guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The courtroom itself reflected the case's gravity. Security was heightened. Sketch artists replaced cameras, capturing moments that photography couldn't. The gallery filled with families, reporters, students of criminal justice, and citizens drawn by the case's notoriety. Every seat was claimed. People lined up hours early, hoping for access. Opening statements began on a cold morning. The prosecutor stood before the jury and laid out the case with clinical precision. No dramatics, no appeals to emotion, just a methodical recitation of what the evidence would prove. Teixeira had entered the penthouse with intent to harm. He'd restrained 2 defenseless people. He'd tortured them before killing them. He'd attempted to stage a false narrative. He'd been caught at the scene, wounded by police responding to Richard's warning text. The defense's opening was more constrained. They acknowledged Teixeira's presence but disputed his intent. They suggested the encounter began differently than prosecutors claimed. They promised to present evidence of a complex relationship that didn't match the simple revenge narrative. But even as they spoke, the jury's expressions suggested skepticism. The defense was asking them to believe an extraordinary alternative to an obvious truth. Witness testimony began immediately. Police officers described their initial response, the strange one-word text, the ascent to the 11th floor, the horror of what they found inside. Their voices remained professional, but the weight of memory showed through. These were veteran officers who'd seen violence before, yet this scene had shaken them. Forensic experts followed, presenting the science that made denial impossible. DNA analysts explained genetic matching with charts and statistics that translated technical processes into understandable conclusions. Blood spatter experts demonstrated how the pattern of stains revealed the sequence of violence. Medical examiners described injuries in clinical terms that couldn't hide their brutality. Each piece of evidence reinforced the prosecution's narrative. Teixeira's fingerprints on the murder weapon, his DNA under the victim's fingernails, surveillance footage tracking his approach to the building, cell phone records showing no communication between him and Lena, destroying his claimed relationship. Testimony from the friend who received Richard's final text, bringing that moment of desperation into the courtroom. The defense cross-examined aggressively, challenging procedures, questioning certainty, seeking any crack in the prosecution's case. But the foundation held. The evidence was too consistent, too overwhelming, too carefully documented to undermine. Then came the moment that would define the trial in public memory. During testimony about the crime scene, Teixeira interrupted proceedings. He stood, voice rising, accusing everyone, prosecutors, police, the system itself, of racism. He claimed he was being persecuted not for what he'd done, but for who he was. Judge Roach gavelled him quiet, but the outburst had already occurred. The jury had seen not a defendant proclaiming innocence, but someone deflecting responsibility onto others. Bailiffs escorted him from the courtroom temporarily. When he returned, a sullen defiance replaced the outburst's energy. He'd revealed himself not as a victim of circumstance, but as someone incapable of accepting accountability for his choices. The trial's middle phase focused on dismantling the defense's alternative narrative. Prosecutors systematically addressed every claim Teixeira had made: the invented romance, the self-defense justification, the suggestion that events unfolded differently than evidence indicated. Digital forensics proved particularly damaging to the defense theory. Investigators had extracted data from Lena's phone, computer, and social media accounts. They found zero communication with Teixeira: no texts, no emails, no messages of any kind. Her contacts list didn't include him. Her calendar showed no meetings with him. Every digital trace of her life, the kind of data that documents modern relationships, proved she had no connection to him, beyond seeing him occasionally in the building lobby when he'd worked there. The prosecution presented this evidence methodically. They showed the jury Lena's text history, her social media interactions, her email correspondence. They demonstrated that her digital life was transparent, thoroughly documented, and contained no evidence of the relationship Teixeira claimed. The absence of evidence became its own proof. You can't hide a relationship in the digital age without leaving traces of the hiding itself. Defense attorneys struggled to counter this. They suggested alternative explanations: secret meetings, burner phones, deliberately deleted messages. But each suggestion sounded more desperate than the last. Occam's razor applied. The simplest explanation was the true one. There was no relationship because Teixeira had invented it, either as delusion or deliberate lie. The prosecution called additional witnesses: colleagues who'd never seen Lena with Teixeira, building staff who confirmed he'd been fired months before the murders, forensic psychologists who characterized his claimed relationship as fantasy rather than reality. Each testimony reinforced what the jury already understood. The defense's narrative was fiction, created to explain the inexplicable. Forensic pathology testimony proved particularly difficult to witness. The medical examiner walked the jury through the sequence of injuries both victims sustained. They explained that this wasn't a quick crime. It unfolded over time, with deliberate infliction of suffering. The victims had been conscious through most of it. They'd known what was happening. They'd struggled to survive. The defense objected to the presentation of autopsy photographs, arguing they were unnecessarily graphic and prejudicial. Judge Roach reviewed the images in chambers before ruling. She allowed them, determining they were probative. They demonstrated the nature of the crime rather than simply inflaming emotions. When presented to the jury, several members visibly struggled. These weren't abstract descriptions of violence. These were human beings reduced to evidence. Perhaps most damning was the testimony about the bindings found on the victims. Forensic analysts had matched the rope used to restrain Lena and Richard to rope found in Teixeira's backpack, recovered near the building. The rope was distinctive, a particular type and color available at common hardware stores but identifiable through manufacturing characteristics. The match was definitive. This evidence destroyed any remaining suggestion of consensual encounter. People don't tie each other up with rope brought in a backpack during romantic meetings. The bindings, combined with the torture injuries, revealed the encounter's true nature: predatory violence inflicted by someone who saw his victims as objects rather than people. As the prosecution's case concluded, they'd built a structure too solid to collapse. DNA, digital evidence, forensic pathology, eyewitness testimony, surveillance footage, recovered physical evidence, every element supported every other element. The case was overdetermined, provable through multiple independent lines of evidence that all reached the same conclusion. The defense's case was brief by necessity. They had little to present. No witnesses contradicted the prosecution's timeline. No evidence supported Teixeira's claims. Their strategy reduced to arguing for reasonable doubt where none existed, asking the jury to believe that overwhelming evidence somehow failed to prove what it obviously proved. When Teixeira's attorney suggested he might testify, the courtroom tensed. Defendants rarely take the stand in murder trials, knowing cross-examination can devastate them, but Teixeira's case was already devastated. Taking the stand offered a chance, however slim, to humanize himself before the jury. He never took that stand. Whether his attorneys advised against it or he chose not to risk cross-examination, the result was the same. The jury never heard directly from him except through his recorded post-arrest statements, already proven false by evidence. Closing arguments approached. The courtroom, filled throughout the trial, reached capacity. People who'd followed every development wanted to witness this final rhetorical battle before deliberation began. The prosecutor stood before the jury as afternoon light slanted through high windows. Their closing argument avoided melodrama. The facts spoke loudly enough. They reviewed the evidence piece by piece, showing how each element proved not just guilt but premeditation and cruelty. They described the victims not as names in a case file, but as people whose lives mattered, whose futures were stolen, whose families deserved justice. They addressed motive not because the law required proving why, but because the jury would wonder. They spoke of resentment, of rage at perceived inequality, of a man who blamed others for his failures and decided that destruction was easier than achievement. They didn't ask the jury to understand Teixeira, they asked them to hold him accountable for choices he'd made with full awareness of their consequences. The defense's closing was more emotional, more desperate. They acknowledged the crime's horror while pleading for the jury to consider lesser charges. They suggested manslaughter rather than first-degree murder, arguing the evidence didn't definitively prove premeditation. They asked for mercy where the evidence demanded accountability. But their argument faced an insurmountable obstacle: the evidence itself. First-degree murder requires premeditation, deliberation, and malice aforethought. The jury had seen Teixeira's preparations, the supplies purchased, the surveillance of the building, the chosen timing. They'd heard about the prolonged torture, proving deliberation. And the malice? That was written in blood across penthouse walls. Outside the courthouse, as closing arguments concluded, protesters gathered. Some held signs demanding justice for the victims, others called for life sentences without parole. The case had become a focal point for broader conversations about violence, about class resentment, about whether any sentence could match such crimes. Judge Roach instructed the jury carefully. She explained the charges, the burden of proof, the definitions of legal terms that would guide their deliberations. She emphasized their responsibility not to emotions or public opinion but to evidence and law. Then she released them to deliberate. The jury room became an island isolated from the trial's chaos. 12 strangers tasked with unanimous decision-making began reviewing evidence, discussing testimony, weighing facts against law. Outside, everyone else could only wait. Jury deliberations lasted longer than the evidence suggested necessary. Not because the case was complex, it wasn't, but because the consequences were profound. These 12 people held someone's life in their hands. Even when guilt is obvious, the gravity of that responsibility requires time to process, discuss, confirm. They reviewed forensic reports, they examined photographs, they replayed testimony in their collective memory. They debated the difference between murder and lesser charges, between justice and vengeance, between punishment and accountability, and gradually, through hours of careful discussion, they reached consensus. The verdict came on a gray afternoon. Word spread quickly through the courthouse that the jury had reached a decision. The courtroom filled within minutes, families rushing back, reporters taking positions, court staff preparing for the moment that would define years of work. Judge Roach entered. Everyone rose. She took her seat, surveying the packed courtroom before signaling for the jury to enter. They filed in silently, taking their seats without looking at Teixeira. That alone told experienced court observers what was coming. The foreperson stood when asked if they'd reached a verdict. Yes, they had, on all counts. The clerk accepted the verdict forms, passing them to Judge Roach for review. She read them silently, her expression unchanging, before returning them to be read aloud. In the matter of the Commonwealth versus Bampumim Teixeira, on the charge of murder in the first degree of Dr. Richard Field, how do you find guilty? The word landed like a physical weight. Someone in the gallery sobbed. Others exhaled breaths held since the jury entered. On the charge of murder in the first degree of Dr. Lina Bolanos, how do you find guilty? The pattern continued through all charges: home invasion, armed robbery, kidnapping, guilty on every count. The jury had found the prosecution met its burden completely, proving beyond reasonable doubt what everyone who'd followed the case already knew. Teixeira showed no emotion as the verdicts were read. He sat motionless, his face blank, as if the words didn't concern him, but his family members in the gallery reacted differently. Shock, tears, the horror of hearing what they'd perhaps hoped wouldn't be true. Judge Roach polled the jury, confirming each member agreed with the verdicts. All 12 affirmed. She thanked them for their service, acknowledging the difficulty of what they'd been asked to do. Then she dismissed them, their role complete. The sentencing phase would come later, but the verdicts themselves brought a measure of closure. The question of guilt debated, defended, litigated was finally answered definitively. Teixeira was a murderer under law. The system had functioned as designed. Families of the victims released statements expressing gratitude for the verdict while acknowledging that no legal outcome could restore what they'd lost. They thanked investigators, prosecutors, and the jury for ensuring accountability. They spoke about the victims' legacies extending beyond this courtroom, beyond this terrible event. Boston's media covered the verdict extensively. Local news led with it. National outlets picked it up. The case, which had gripped the city for years, had reached its formal conclusion. Yet everyone understood that verdicts aren't endings, they're transitions from one phase to another. Sentencing day arrived several weeks later. The courtroom filled again, this time for the ritual of declaring consequences. Judge Roach had reviewed pre-sentencing reports, considered legal arguments about appropriate penalties, and prepared remarks that would formalize the jury's verdict into punishment. Before the sentence, victims' families were given the opportunity to address the court. This moment victim impact statements allows those most affected by crimes to speak directly to judges about the harm inflicted, the losses sustained, the ongoing consequences of violence. Richard's family spoke first. His brother described a life of service ended senselessly, a future of humanitarian work erased by rage. He talked about family gatherings that would forever feel incomplete, about children who would never know their uncle, about the ripple effects of violence extending far beyond the immediate victims. Lena's family followed. Her mother spoke haltingly, her voice breaking as she described the daughter she'd raised, the dreams they'd shared, the proud moments of watching her succeed in a demanding profession. She spoke not of vengeance but of absence, the permanence of loss that no sentence could repair. Other colleagues and friends added their voices. They described the doctor's compassion, their dedication, their kindness. They spoke of patients who'd benefited from their care, of students they'd mentored, of communities they'd served. The statements painted a portrait of lives lived with purpose, made more tragic by their violent endings. Through all of this, Teixeira remained impassive. He showed no reaction to descriptions of the suffering he'd caused, no acknowledgement of the devastation in his wake. His affect was flat, disconnected, as if hearing about someone else's crimes rather than his own. Finally, Judge Roach spoke. Her sentencing statement was measured but firm. She acknowledged the crime's brutality, the premeditation evident in the facts, the utter lack of justification for the violence inflicted. She noted Teixeira's complete absence of remorse, his attempts to blame victims for their deaths, his refusal to accept responsibility for choices he'd made freely. The sentence, life in prison without possibility of parole on each murder count, to be served consecutively. Additional time on the remaining charges. Effectively, Teixeira would die in prison. He would never again walk free. He would never again pose a threat to society. As Judge Roach pronounced the sentence, a collective exhale moved through the courtroom. This was the maximum punishment. Massachusetts law allowed true life imprisonment with no chance of release. Justice, as much as the legal system could provide, had been delivered. But then, Teixeira spoke. Uninvited, unrepentant, he addressed the court. He didn't apologize or express remorse. Instead, he launched into accusations of racism, claiming persecution, suggesting he was the real victim. He smirked as he spoke, his tone defiant rather than remorseful. Judge Roach cut him off. She'd given him every procedural protection the law required. She'd ensured a fair trial. His conviction was supported by overwhelming evidence. His sentence matched his crimes. She had no interest in entertaining fantasies of persecution from someone who'd tortured and murdered two innocent people. Bailiffs escorted Teixeira from the courtroom. As he left, he continued muttering accusations, blaming everyone but himself. His final appearance before the public revealed exactly what investigators and prosecutors had documented: someone incapable of accepting responsibility, someone who saw himself as a victim, even while inflicting unimaginable harm on others. The courtroom slowly emptied. Families embraced. Prosecutors gathered their files. Reporters rushed to file stories. The formal machinery of justice had completed its work. All that remained was processing the emotional aftermath. In the weeks following sentencing, Boston began its quiet process of reflection and healing. The trial had reopened wounds, forced the city to confront uncomfortable truths about safety, privilege, and violence. Now came the harder work of finding meaning in tragedy, of ensuring that two lives ended senselessly wouldn't be reduced to crime statistics. Vigils continued at both hospitals where the victims had worked. Colleagues organized memorial services that celebrated their contributions to medicine rather than dwelling on their deaths. Stories circulated of lives saved, of patients comforted, of students inspired. The narrative slowly shifted from how they died to how they lived. Community organizations channeled public grief into action. A scholarship fund established in the victims' names would support medical students from underserved backgrounds, creating opportunities that might prevent the kind of resentment that had festered in Teixeira. Building security protocols across Boston were reviewed and strengthened. acknowledging that the McAllens' protections had failed not through negligence but through the insider threat Teixeira represented. Media retrospectives examined the case from multiple angles. Journalists explored how Teixeira's criminal history, bank robberies, violent behavior hadn't prevented his employment in a luxury building with access to residents' homes. They questioned whether better background checks, more rigorous security protocols, or different hiring practices might have prevented the tragedy. These weren't comfortable questions, but they were necessary ones. Psychologists and sociologists used the case to discuss broader issues of class resentment, of how inequality breeds rage in individuals who respond not with productive action but with destructive fury. They noted that while economic frustration might explain Teixeira's bitterness, nothing justified or excused his choices. Many people face hardship without turning to violence. Teixeira chose murder when countless others in similar circumstances choose differently. The legal community analyzed the trial as a case study in criminal procedure. The evidence had been overwhelming, the investigation thorough, the prosecution's presentation methodical. Defense attorneys faced with impossible cases received little sympathy. They'd fulfilled their ethical duty to provide vigorous representation while acknowledging the obvious outcome. Judge Roach's handling of the proceedings earned praise for balancing fairness with efficiency. But beyond professional analysis and institutional response, individuals carried their own processing of the tragedy. The friend who'd received Richard's final text lived with questions about whether he could have done more, acted faster, changed the outcome. Rationally, he knew the answer was no, but grief isn't rational. Neighbors in the McAllen building struggled with the violation of their sense of security. They'd chosen this building specifically for its safety measures, only to learn that no system is perfect, no protection absolute. For Richard's and Lena's families, the conclusion of the trial brought no true closure, only a shift from legal uncertainty to permanent loss. They'd attended every hearing, maintained dignity through unimaginable pain, and seen justice delivered as completely as the law allowed. Yet they'd trade every guilty verdict, every life sentence, for just 5 more minutes with the people they'd lost. Their grief work continued privately, away from cameras and courtrooms. They established foundations in the victims' names, organized annual memorial events, and worked to ensure that 2 lives of service would be remembered for their contributions rather than their tragic ends. This was the real work of healing, not forgetting or moving on, but finding ways to carry loss without being consumed by it. Boston's South End, where the McAllen building stood, struggled with its own contradictions. The neighborhood had long represented upward mobility, a place where success could buy safety. The murders challenged that narrative. They proved that violence doesn't respect property values, that danger can emerge from within supposedly secure spaces, that privilege offers no immunity from human cruelty. Some residents moved away, unable to remain in a building haunted by memory. Others stayed, refusing to let fear dictate their choices. The building implemented new security measures, additional cameras, modified access protocols, background checks for all staff. These changes couldn't undo what happened, but they represented a commitment to learning from tragedy. The penthouse itself remained empty for a long time. No one wanted to live in a space that had witnessed such horror. Eventually, it was extensively renovated, walls replaced, floors refinished, every trace of violence removed. But even physical transformation couldn't erase what everyone knew had occurred there. The address remained associated with tragedy, a reminder that geography holds memory. As months became years, the case gradually faded from daily news cycles. New tragedies competed for public attention. Boston, like any city, moved through cycles of crisis and recovery, never forgetting but necessarily shifting focus to present challenges rather than past horrors. Yet for those directly involved, families, investigators, jurors, witnesses, the case remained permanently present. They carried it differently than casual observers. They'd seen the photographs, heard the testimony, felt the weight of loss and responsibility. Some sought therapy to process what they'd experienced. Others found meaning through advocacy, working to prevent similar tragedies through improved security measures or criminal justice reforms. The detective who'd first entered the penthouse that terrible May evening still thought about it. Not obsessively, but regularly, the way professional caregivers carry the difficult cases that shape their understanding of human capacity for both good and evil. The experience changed how he approached investigations, made him more attuned to the human cost beneath the procedural work. The prosecutor moved on to other cases but kept a folder on this one. It represented thorough work, a just outcome, a system functioning as designed. But it also represented 2 lives that couldn't be saved, no matter how perfectly the investigation unfolded or how definitively justice was delivered. Judge Roach continued presiding over criminal trials, each one demanding similar attention to fairness and procedure. But this case stood out for the brutality of the crime, for the defendant's complete lack of remorse, for the family's dignified pain. It reinforced her belief in law's importance while acknowledging its limitations. The legal system could punish crime, it couldn't resurrect victims or heal grief. On the anniversary of the murders, Boston Medical Center held a memorial service. Colleagues who'd worked alongside Richard and Lena gathered to share memories, to acknowledge what was lost, to commit to carrying forward their legacy of compassionate care. Medical students who'd never known them personally attended anyway, understanding that their deaths represented every physician's vulnerability, dedicating yourself to healing others while remaining unable to protect yourself from random violence. The McAllen Building's lobby displayed a small plaque commemorating the victims. It was subtle, not overwhelming, acknowledging tragedy without defining the space entirely through it. The building had to serve its residents' present needs while respecting past loss. The plaque's placement represented that balance, visible enough to honor memory, discreet enough to allow life to continue. Teixeira remained in prison, his appeals automatically proceeding through Massachusetts's judicial system despite offering little chance of success. The evidence was overwhelming. The trial was procedurally sound. The sentence was lawful. Appeals courts would eventually confirm what the trial jury decided. He was guilty, the punishment appropriate, justice served. In prison, reports suggested he maintained his defiance, his refusal to accept responsibility, his insistence that everyone else was wrong. Prison psychologists noted this wasn't unusual among violent offenders. The ego protections that allowed someone to commit such acts often prevented them from facing what they'd done. Remorse requires recognizing the humanity of victims, something Teixeira had never demonstrated. But his prison psychology wasn't society's concern anymore. He was contained. He couldn't harm anyone else. The purpose of punishment, protecting public safety, delivering justice, potentially deterring others, had been achieved. Whether he ever gained insight into his actions mattered less than ensuring he could never repeat them. As Boston moved forward, carrying this tragedy among countless others in its long history, the question lingered: what had been learned? Security measures improved. Discussions about class resentment intensified. Healthcare workers received additional training on personal safety. These were tangible responses to specific failures the case exposed. But the deeper lessons resisted easy summary, that evil often wears familiar faces, that resentment unaddressed can fester into violence, that privilege buys amenities but not immunity from human darkness, that one person's choice to harm reverberates through families, communities, and systems for years afterward. That justice, when finally delivered, feels necessary yet insufficient. It holds perpetrators accountable, without restoring what was taken. The story of Dr. Lena Bolanos and Dr. Richard Field ended in a penthouse on May 5, 2017, but their legacy continued through the lives they'd touched, the patients they'd treated, the students they'd mentored, the families who carried their memory forward with grace and determination, and through a city that refused to let their deaths be the final word on their meaning. On quiet evenings in Boston's South End, the McAllen Building's lights still glitter against the harbor. Residents move through their routines behind glass walls. The city hums with its eternal rhythm of work and rest, ambition and contentment, hope and fear intertwined. And sometimes, when the wind shifts just right, it carries the memory of a single word sent into darkness: gunman, a final warning, a last act of courage, a reminder that even when safety fails and violence arrives, the human spirit reaches out, hoping against hope that connection might still matter, that someone might still arrive in time to change the ending. They didn't arrive in time for Richard and Lena, but their warning lived on, their story was told, their legacy honored, and in a city of millions moving forward while carrying their dead, that had to be enough.